Wait, this is going to be the first of two videos I'm going to make on natural monopoly. And this one here, I'm going to try to ask the question or address the question of why is this referred to as natural monopoly. So this is a diagram that I like to use to show natural monopoly. And what I've done here is a natural monopoly refers to any case where the cost per unit, the average cost, is falling throughout the range, the relevant market range of the good. So what I've done is drawn up a market demand curve here. So this would be whatever product this is, like say electricity. This is the demand for electricity. And this is the total market demand in whatever the geographic market that we're looking at. So here's the market demand, and here's the average cost curve. And the average cost curve is declining throughout the range of the market demand curve. I put that qualification in there because it might be the case that eventually, if you think about this average cost curve, maybe this average cost curve could start to bend up someplace way over here to the right. Well, that's kind of irrelevant because this is how much people might possibly want to buy in this market. So, if it is possible that eventually, at a very high enough level of quantity, that the average cost curve could start going up, then we want to distinguish that. Sometimes there is a really strong reason to expect that we'd have a declining average cost curve, whatever the quantity might be. There are some things where the nature of the production of the goods should actually be of that sort. What I've done here is we have a constant marginal cost and then a declining average cost curve. And I like to draw that there because what that sort of, to my mind, representing is that this would be a good where there's a very large, well, you would look at this and you might think like this looks like the average fixed cost in the short run for a firm. And it does look like that. But since we're talking about possibly the long run here, we're not making a short run, long run distinction. That can't be what we have here. But there are cases where there are goods where I'd like to, what I think of as a first unit cost. To produce 1 unit of the good, you have to incur a large cost. And then after that, there might be a cost of providing additional units of the good, but that cost of providing additional units of the good might be relatively low. So one way to think about it is think of like a newspaper. When you're doing a newspaper, you have to spend a lot of money, like reporting, hiring reporters, reporting stories, writing those stories up, editing them, getting ads, putting the ads in there, laying out the paper. And so you've incurred a whole bunch of costs before you can print even one copy of the paper. Now, once you have the newspaper all laid out and ready to print, printing extra copies is relatively small. But the point is you have to incur those first unit costs before you can print out even a single copy of the paper. If you have a small number of units, then that's going to give you a very high cost per your average cost. Your cost per unit is going to be quite high. As you produce more and more of the good, well, yes, you have to incur the marginal cost of producing the extra units, but you get to divide out those first unit costs over a much larger quantity. So you have something that looks like that the declining average fixed cost curve from before, but I would think of it as a first unit cost. So what's natural about monopoly here? Well, there's two ways you can think about naturalness of monopoly here. One would be is that if we had competition in this industry, if we had a bunch of firms, we had several different firms, like say 10 or 12 firms trying to supply the market quantity, and they all happen to be identical, they would be, if you had, like say, if this was about, say, 100 units over here, and you had a whole bunch of firms over here, and they happen to be producing about the same amount of the good, they could have the same cost per unit. But then, what if one of those firms got to be bigger than the other? In this kind of an industry where you have a declining average cost, if one firm gets to be larger than the other, their cost per unit falls. As their cost per unit falls, they can lower the price. And they can lower the price without making a loss. This isn't predatory pricing, because predatory pricing, which we'll talk about in chapter 12. Predatory pricing means you're charging a price where you're going to be making a loss. If one firm gets to be bigger than the other firms here, they have a lower cost per unit. They can charge a zero profit price, a price that allows them to cover their costs, but it would be lower than the price that they could charge, that their competitors could charge. So if you had a bunch of firms and they were all here operating off their average cost curve, they'd all have to be charging a price of P1. If one of these firms happens to get a little bit bigger than the other, so you have a whole bunch of firms here and they're all at Q1, now one gets a little bit bigger here and pushes their quantity out to Q2. Their cost per unit falls. They can cut their price from P1 to P2 and still make a zero profit. So they're not operating at a loss. They have lower cost per unit. They can charge a lower price and still cover their costs. Now, if you have perfect competition here, one of the assumptions of perfect competition was a homogeneous product. So from the consumer standpoint, remember, the only thing that they cared about was price. If you're the consumers in this market and one of these companies, one of these suppliers starts to charge a lower price, that's going to be the one you want to go with. So if one of these companies gets to be bigger than the others, they can lower their price because they have lower costs, and then they're going to steal customers away from the other firms. So what are the other firms in this industry going to have to do? Well, I mean, they could continue to charge a price of P1 to try to cover their costs, and they'll lose customers to the firm that's gotten a little bit bigger. Or they could try to lower their price to stay competitive with the one firm that's gotten a little bit bigger. But their costs are reflected by this higher price. They were charging a price before that reflected their higher price. So they could cut their price and make a loss to try to keep from losing customers, or they could continue to charge a price that allows them to cover their costs, and then they will lose customers. So in a situation like this, competition, even if you had a bunch of firms in this industry, competition wouldn't be very stable. If one firm got to be a little bit bigger than the others, then they have this cost advantage. They can cut their price. As they cut their price, they gain more competition. They steal customers away from the other companies. That allows them to push out here and have even a lower price. And this whole thing would likely go through a process of unraveling. You get down to having one firm in this industry. So that's one of the reasons you could think of natural monopoly being natural here, because you really couldn't expect to see competition persist over a very long period of time. As soon as one firm gets to be bigger than the others, they have a cost advantage, and they're going to be able to drive the other firms out of business. Another way of thinking about it is that when you have, especially if you think of these first unit costs, when you have a declining average cost curve, if you have huge first unit costs, then in one sense, to produce the good at the lowest possible total cost, it's efficient to have one firm. It is efficient to have one firm produce the entire amount. One way to think of it is like another case where you'd have a high first unit cost would be with electricity, an electricity grid. Why? If you're going to have two firms attempt to deliver electricity and they're going to have their own grids, you're going to have two grids next to each other. You have this huge first unit cost that has to be incurred twice. The cost per unit of production, once you have those first unit costs paid, they're relatively low. So in other words, the point would be to have the lowest possible cost of production. You want to have one firm produce the entire amount. We can see that on this diagram here by saying, suppose we're going to have suppose we want to have this quantity produced out here. If we have one firm produce this quantity of the good, total cost, well, we read up to the average cost curve and over. That gives us cost per unit, so we'll call that C. And then the total cost would be this rectangle. It would be the cost per unit multiplied by the quantity. What if we had two firms and they were going to each produce half of that? So we'll come over here to Q over 2. So we have two firms operating at Q over 2. their cost per unit, well, we have to read up to the average cost curve and over, their cost per unit will be higher, C2. So one firm would incur a cost of this amount, and then the other firm would incur the exact same cost if they're each producing Q over 2. So the total cost of producing this quantity Q would be higher if we had two firms producing it than if we had one firm. So this is the second reason which we can think of monopoly being natural here. Normally in perfect competition, we have productive efficiency. Every firm's operating at the minimum of their U-shaped long-run average cost curve. And when we have a whole bunch of firms operating there, we've minimized the cost of producing the quantity that the market wants. To minimize the cost of producing whatever quantity people in the market want here with natural monopoly, you want to have one firm. You want to incur those first unit costs only one time. So that's why a monopoly in this case would be natural. And one thing that would follow from the fact that it's natural here is that antitrust, trying to keep this market competitive, wouldn't be a very good solution. So before we had the market, or that diagram where we were comparing competition and monopoly, that'd be a case where you could sustain competition. This would be a case where we really couldn't sustain competition, and it wouldn't be very effective. It would be quite inefficient to try to sustain competition. So in a naturally monopolistic industry, not only would it be hard to try to sustain competition, but antitrust, trying to maintain competition, wouldn't be a very good policy. We want to do something else, and that's what we'll look at with the next video.